Welcome to this episode. My name is Mary Grace Gardner. I am founder of the Young Professionista. I'm a college admissions and career coach who helps students find their passions and write compelling college application essays so that they can apply to college with confidence. And today I am interviewing Laura Link, who is founder of Link Private Tutoring. She's a certified teacher specializing in building student strengths. And in her 12 years helping students raise their test scores, she's discovered secrets that help students and have them earn high ACT and SAT evidence-based reading and writing test scores that result in college acceptances and scholarship money. She is also the communications director of the National Test Prep Association. We'll get a moment to talk about that a little bit more. She is a sought-after test prep expert and has traveled the United States training teachers on how to help their students raise their ACT and SAT scores. So Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Likewise, I'm so excited to have this opportunity to talk with you. So first, let's start off with you telling us more about your educational and career journey and then how you help students with the SAT and the ACT.
Absolutely. Well, I started out my career when I was the student looking to go to school and decide what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer. I started out wanting to be a writer. And so I was a journalist, and then I moved into public relations. And then I completely pivoted into teaching writing. And so I became a high school teacher, and I specialized in teaching reading to students who had to take intensive reading courses because they were having trouble with reading. And that was in South Florida, and a lot of students were English language learners. And so as part of that, I started helping them with their reading initially, their English ACT and SAT. And so the counselors started sending me students to work with after school. And parents started calling me, and I just found that I loved it. I love being able to help students and have them come in and say, I reached my goal. I'm going to my dream college, or I got accepted to my dream college, but I needed 3 or more points on the ACT or 100 more points on the SAT in order to get the scholarship to afford it. And thanks to you, now I can go because I can afford it. So I love it. I love working with students and helping them like maximize their potential.
I think it's really neat that you have those different perspectives. So as you are helping your students, you're able to draw from your past work experience and then now just all these different clients and students that you've worked with over the years to really hone in on what specifically they might need to improve their test taking abilities.
Absolutely. That's kind of my specialty because having been or being a teacher, I can work with students in tutoring and target very quickly what they need. So we go right into what their needs are as opposed to them having to go through a complete cookie cutter program that everybody goes through. We just work right on what they need. And test prep is helpful because even the students who've got great grades and they're already pretty decent at taking the test, but they're not raising their score, it's generally because they don't understand the mechanics of the test, how it's formatted, what questions show up again and again. And it is worth practice, and it does raise scores.
That's really interesting too. I really appreciate that specialized approach that you have with students. And I know we're going to be talking both about the ACT and then we're specifically highlighting the SAT EBRW portion or the
Yeah.
evidence-based reading and writing portion. And it is difficult to have or find more customized approaches oftentimes, right? It's not necessarily something where everyone would have the same difficulties. And so being able to kind of pinpoint from a teacher's perspective too, I think is helpful to be able to pinpoint what might that student be learning in school. And at the same time, kind of how to draw the parallel into how they can learn differently or approach things differently for that particular test can be pretty powerful.
Right. And every student is unique, so we cannot assume what they know or what they don't know based on their grades or their practice test scores. You've got to get in front of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important notion. So, for those of you who are watching this live, we're also broadcasting this live on Facebook. So, welcome. If you're watching this live, let us know in the comments where you're watching this from. And if you've got questions for Laura or questions for me, let us know in the comments. And if you're watching this on the replay, just go ahead and type hashtag replay so that we know that you're a replay viewer. And we'll go ahead and come back to any questions or comments that you have. Laura and I would be happy to answer them. All right, so let's go ahead and jump also into why did you decide to go into this specific line of work?
Well, the teaching, like I said, the teaching came, believe it or not, because my career in public relations was just kind of naturally coming to an organic end. And I had moved, and I had these wonderful neighbors who were teachers. And they said, "Hey, why don't you just go maybe apply to be a substitute teacher in reading or English? See if you like it. Make up your mind." Well, what I ended up doing was I took the test, I passed the test, and when you come into teaching as a second year, I mean, a second career, you generally in most states have about 3 years to get all your full certifications. And if you don't in that time, then you can't continue to be a teacher. But if you do, then you can move on. So I had 3 years to make this decision. Well, the first semester, I was teaching the intensive reading students, and it was definitely a culture shock. But after I saw the successes that they had, I was hooked. So I knew, and I immediately, while getting my full teaching professional certificate, I also took classes in my English as a second language certificate and my reading certification. And I've always been, being a journalist, I was teaching anyway, right? I was interviewing people and learning about what they did and then pulling that together and writing about it to help other people to understand it. So it was just, I didn't know that it would be a natural fit when my neighbor said, "Try, see," but it absolutely was, and I've never looked back.
I really appreciate that you followed your interests and it wasn't necessarily I know this is the thing that I'm really great at, I'm just going to do. It's, I followed something that seemed interesting and then one thing led to another, and this is how you ended up where you are. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is I know oftentimes students, especially if the students are watching this, who might not know what they want to do or be, and you probably never thought that this was going to be the place you were going to be, right? And you wouldn't have followed it or found it had you not just tried something different and new and given yourself that exposure.
Absolutely, and when you're talking to students who are thinking about that, um, there's something called a skills-based resume, right? And that's basically what they recommend these days is skills-based resume. But if you go deeper into the idea of a skills-based resume, I have stayed true to my skills from my first journalism job all the way through to teaching and the private tutoring that I do because I love to gather information. I love to help maximize people's knowledge. I love to walk them through it and be able to help them with that and help people grow and share information and share knowledge. I'm always learning and then I'm always sharing what I learn. So if students who are in middle school or high school can think about their career in terms of what they love. Like you said, what do you love? What are your interests? There are so many different careers that are going to match, and you don't know how that's going to play out in your life. Just be open to it.
Yeah, I think that I'm so in alignment there is oftentimes when I'm working with students, it's focusing on what do you like, what are questions you want to solve, what are just impacts you want to make, and not to put so much pressure on the exact thing you might want to be because you actually have no idea probably of the range of things you can choose from. You
Absolutely.
might know a certain type, you might know a couple jobs when you're in high school, but when you're in college, you get exposed to so many new topics. And then even beyond college, you learn about so many different jobs that exist. And so not limiting yourself necessarily, unless you know for sure this one thing is what I want to be,
Right.
not knowing what that one thing is, it's okay as long as you're following what you're interested in. And that will lead you to the next natural step. So you mentioned that you're part of that National Test Prep Association. So I wanted to just have our team here that's listening learn more about that. So you're the communications director for them.
Yes.
So tell us more about what that association is. What do they do? How did you get involved?
The National Test Prep Association was the brainchild of Amy Seeley and Mike Bergen, who are two amazing tutors, and they have their own companies. And they networked together, and they had been thinking about this, and then COVID hit. And they created in their Facebook group a every Friday we would get together, we'd have a happy hour, and it was just, if you are a test prep professional, you're welcome. And we collaborated and we learned so much from each other. And one of the things that we learned was that we all felt like ethics were a very important part that was missing from test prep professional. In fact, if you hear tutor, what do you think? You might think high school student who does it for free to help their friends or for very low price. You might think college student. A lot of people, when you hear tutor, you think of college student, which is why I do use the word tutor, but I also use the word test prep professional because it's so much more than that. So the ethics of what you say you can do and what you can actually do, how we help our students, was the first nugget of pulling together the National Test Prep Association. And so now we've got a website, and I don't know how many members we have, but it's growing by like 5 members a week. And it's focused around, we sign on to this code of ethics, and we collaborate and we deliver professional development, all in a formal nonprofit setting that really did not exist before for our profession.
I think that's
And
so important. The ethical aspect of the work related to helping students get into college in an ethical way. There's been so much controversy where there are coaches, counselors, consultants who do things unethically, right? There's a Netflix documentary on,
Varsity
yeah,
Blues, right?
exactly, right? We see it in the news where people are doing all these unethical things. And I think it is important that there is some standard of ethics, right? Where there is an agreement of how people act and the kind of promises that you can make to students. I think every time I encounter families who say, well, so this counselor said that they can guarantee the student gets into Harvard or can guarantee. I said, there are no guarantees in any of this, right? We can do our best to best equip a student to be more knowledgeable, to have the skills and pinpoint what they need to do. But it all lies on the student, right? It all lies on that student putting in the work, and it all lies on that student following through and figuring things out, right? We can't give them necessarily the keys to a specific perfect score, perfect A, perfect anything. It's the student who needs to follow through.
No, and I've known students with weighted averages above a 5 and perfect ACT scores who didn't get into Harvard. And this is important for students to know, that it is not, it's kind of like a job. Like if you go to a company and say, I want to do this job, they're not even going to interview you if they don't have a need for that job, right? If that job is not available there, then it's not about you, it's about they don't have that job. Well, what a lot of people don't know, and this is why you do want to apply to multiple colleges, but not like 29. I mean, that's a little crazy. Is that they do have slots for, we are looking for a bioengineering. We have 10 slots in bioengineering and we have 2 theater slots. Well, you may have a lower ACT score than the theater applicant, but they already filled their theater slots. And so your bioengineering may get in. There's that as well, and that you just don't know. And they don't really know completely until they see who applies. They don't know what mix of students they're going to get and who they're going to be able to work with. Um, so yeah, guarantees, I would run away from guarantees. If you're looking for a test prep professional and they talk guarantees, the only kind of guarantee that any good test prep professional would give is, if you don't raise your score a certain number of points, we'll give you free sessions till you do, or we'll let you join the class again. Like that would make sense, but they can't guarantee that the child will do the homework, that the child will apply what's
Mhm.
what's taught.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so it's so much to it, and I appreciate that you also raised that even if you get the perfect test score and the perfect GPA, it doesn't necessarily lead to the admission, right? I remember my time as part of the UC Berkeley admissions team where we were looking at applications and everyone was phenomenal, right? You just saw great grades, great test scores, great extracurriculars, and so sometimes it's not the student didn't do anything wrong. There's just a highly competitive applicant pool, right? And and in order to enter that highly competitive applicant pool, high grades were required. High test scores are also required. And so I know sometimes when I see in online forums or I see people shocked that their child was rejected from the Ivy League despite having a 1590 and a 4.0. And my heart goes out to them because I remember how hard it was to get those grades and to get those test scores and so much stress and so much effort. And to get that rejection or wait list can be devastating. And when you're looking at places where they're accepting less than 4% of the people who apply, you can imagine that the majority of those folks actually did have high competitive scores in multiple dimensions. And it could be, like you said, a mismatch of fit, or they had two of the exact same person, but they didn't have anyone in this particular state. And they had lots of people from New York. So they chose the person from Oklahoma instead, right? I'm making that up. But sometimes it
Right.
could be factors that the student can't control. And GPA grades and SAT scores still could, or ACT scores still continue to be a standard, though, of you need that in order to even be part of the pool that gets reviewed, right? You still need a certain level of performance in order to even get your essays read or even to have your letter of recommendation reviewed, right? If you don't hit that threshold, then you don't even have a chance to move on to the next level, right? So, which is why we're having this conversation still about test
Right.
scores. And,
And
and so with that,
yeah.
I wanted to ask because there has been so much tumult over the past year and a half because of the pandemic, where students have been signing up for tests, studying for tests, and then it gets canceled or indefinitely canceled because of COVID-19 restrictions. And so many families right now are wondering whether or not is it still worth it to prepare and take these tests. So many students have spent hours studying and they just get the tests canceled last minute, or the college they ended up applying to for the 12th graders now, many of them ended up becoming test optional, or they actually didn't consider the test altogether. And so I'm curious, what would be your advice to those families now who are considering, especially for those who are parents of 10th graders, 11th graders now who haven't gone through the application process yet? What's your advice to those families who are wondering, is it still worth it to be studying and taking these tests?
I was just reading an article that said, can we extrapolate data from 2020 to the future for education and college admissions? And the premise was that no, we can't, that it was an anomaly. If you were a scientist, it would have been the data that you threw out. So, what I have to say, which is really critical for parents of even this year's juniors, class of 2022, or anybody younger than that, is we have no idea what's going to happen next year as far as schools who went test optional this year, whether they're going to stick to it. Um, Expect them not to, except for university, I mean, the California system. Now, even the California system, however, has said that they plan to create their own test. So there's still going to be, if they end up doing it, a test that students will have to take. And I personally feel like that's kind of a shame. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but now they're going to have to eventually take a test and it's just going to be a different one. Um, but anyway, so there is a very good chance that schools that went test optional, especially the ones who did it kind of grudgingly, are going to go back to considering scores next year or the year after that. Because after all, the true reason that schools went test optional, I'm sorry to say, was not to give you a break. It was because they were afraid that they wouldn't meet their tuition finance needs, that people wouldn't have their scores, and if they required their scores, they wouldn't get as many people applying. So they said, what can we do to make sure that we still have a full freshman class for the class of 2020 and then now the class of 2021 if these students legitimately cannot give us a test score? And so they said, well, we just will accept, we will look at everything else. We'll look at their extracurriculars. We'll look at their passion projects if they have them. We'll look at their letters of recommendation and their grades. But there is a problem with grade inflation, and you can go to different schools and have vastly different grades. You have students with 4.0s who are getting, 1100 on the SAT. And so those schools are likely to go back to that objective measurement to consider. So especially parents of 10th graders, I would say do prepare. And the advice even now for this year's seniors is if you did get to take the test, the ACT or the SAT, and your scores are competitive with that school's average scores, which you can find out in their college data sheet, then send your scores. What's happening is the most selective colleges are being bombarded. They have more applications than they ever have before because of these are students who could not have, like you said, they wouldn't have even been looked at. They wouldn't have even opened that envelope because they didn't have them, they didn't meet the minimum grade. Well, now they're looking at these students and they've got good grades and they've got everything else and they're admitting them, and that's wonderful for those students. But I can't say count on that continuing. Best plan is do prepare, take a practice test, get a baseline, do prepare, take the test, the real test one more time, and see where you stand. If you're close to be competitive, then keep pushing it. If you are really much lower than you expect it to be, the test is not for you. Your student has terrible test anxiety and their grades are okay and they don't want to go to a competitive university and the state university is not requiring test scores. Don't put them through it. Get one test score or two so you've got them. Don't invest a huge amount of money in tutoring. Maybe just do a boot camp or something like that so they know what they're getting into. I do not like students going in to take the test with no clue because that just creates anxiety. And let that be. That's fine. The first question that I ask my parents when they call me and students again when I first see them is, what are your goals? What was your ACT score or your practice score? Where do you want to go to college? Are you looking for a score for admissions or are you looking for a score for a scholarship? We map out their goals and I will advise them, all right, you don't need to keep taking this test till you get a 30. All you need is a 25 and then you've got admission and all the money that you're saying you need in scholarships. There is no reason to push yourself beyond what your actual needs are.
I think that last point is really important because sometimes the students that I work with are perfectionistic, right? And so they get a high score, but they know they can get a little bit higher, and then they just commit to doing it again and again. And these tests are not easy to take, right? There's prep that is involved. There's some stress, like anyone taking a high stakes test. There's stress involved on the day of, and even the decompression right after, right? So once you've actually reached that score that you need to get what your goals are, even just giving yourself the permission of, okay, I can let that go now and focus on other things, I think is something that we don't always talk about because there's always just focus on perfection, right? And so I appreciate that. And then I wanted to go back on that notion you were just mentioning too of the best way to kind of approach this, because this has been such a controversial year and a difficult year where I know students were in test prep programs and then ready to take the test right after, but then the test never happened. And then I understand, just like with anything, it can be very disheartening to have put in all this effort and feel like you can't take the test. And then I had some students who for the whole year, right, weren't sure what was going to happen. And similarly to what you're sharing is what was my advice as well, is that we don't know exactly what the situation is going to be. And my advice had always been even studying just a little bit so you don't forget everything, because this is the type of information that if you are not practicing it every day, it may go away because you're not using it for class for some of these things. And so even just a little bit of maybe looking at past past problems you worked on, or giving yourself just some exposure until it looks very realistic that the test that's about to come up will happen, then putting in that effort again to ramp back up. But having this high consistency of intense studying over and over, if they had done that for the whole year and it was canceled the whole time, it's a recipe for burnout. And so I think that pacing of the student is really important. And it's not just admissions, it's also scholarships. Sometimes the scholarships from the school still depend on it, or scholarships that are outside scholarships where they ask for these numbers as well. And so my advice had always been, if you can take it and you think you'll do well, and the schools you want to go to look at it or may consider it, do it. It's better to have it and then not need to report it later on than to wish you had taken it and now it is limiting the number of schools that you can apply to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And do you mind, can I give students some key things that they should be doing based on what you were talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, go for it. I know that they would
Learn,
find it so helpful.
learn your comma rules, every single comma rule, and learn, this is a multiple choice test, right? So learn what you cannot do with a comma. If you
Oh,
memorize
ACT, Laura, ACT or SAT? Go ahead
both,
and also
both,
clarify for groups.
both, ACT English, SAT writing, they test commas.
Mhm.
So learn what you cannot do with a comma. For example, you can't put a single comma before or after the word that. You can't put a single comma before or after preposition. Learn about how to use paired commas, which is like a part of the sentence that you can just take out and then you still got this. Understand everything about those commas. Google punctuating clauses, and then you're going to get beyond the commas into semicolons and coordinating conjunctions. Learn that whole, it is so worth it. And let me tell you, it's going to help your essay scores in school. It's going to help in college. So that is just one thing that students can do that is, I feel like if I can let them know that this is not just something you're learning for the test, this is something you're learning for life. And reading. Some of my best students who are getting some of the higher scores, especially for the SAT, are reading every day. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they're reading current events. I highly recommend a website called Science Daily. The passages are very similar to a lot of the passages you're going to see on the ACT and some of the passages you're going to see on the SAT. And then for the SAT, you have got to read some older passages, because there are two passages that are about history. They call them the like founding documents. They call it the Great Global Conversation. So read about suffrage, read about the founding of the country, read about civil rights, and just things that are about 100 years old, and talk to people about it. After you've read something, just share it with somebody. That I just read an article about whatever. And so if families can do that, when I could get families on board and they actually talk about it over the dinner table, let's talk about this article, let's debate it. You won't believe the SAT and ACT prep you were actually doing, and you're bonding as a family. So those are two tips that people can do right now, even if without even doing practice tests.
Oh, I love this. So I love that there's ways to integrate into regular life
Mhm.
and to still have it be helpful for school itself, right? Because I know oftentimes as people are just doing practice tests over and over and over again, they might feel like, oh, this is not helpful for school. And now I'm getting distracted from my homework, versus what you're sharing are these are everyday things that people can be doing regardless of what grade you're in, to improve your writing skills, your comprehension skills, your communication skills too, and these topics too are helpful to know more about in general, just to be knowledgeable about them as well. So I really think that students can take this sort of real experience and then have it apply to their test taking.
Yes. And that reminds me, something that I wanted to suggest is, if you know you are going to be hiring a test prep tutor at some point, do not take all the available tests out there before you work with the tutor. We used to say practice makes perfect. as teachers, we say perfect practice makes perfect. And if you practice and use up all the practice tests that are out there without help, then you're just continuing to do the wrong thing over and over again. Yes, you are learning more about what the test looks like, but if you haven't been taught to how to analyze it, how to go through it, then you're using up those tests and not maximizing the use of them. So do 2 or 3 practice tests, but if you know you're going to hire a tutor, save them to work through with the tutor. Because any really good tutor is going to work with the actual tests that are released from the College Board for the SAT or from the ACT for that test.
I think that's a good point because I think people don't also realize that even just taking the practice, they might memorize the right answer without actually knowing the technique behind it. So if they were to
Right.
be shown something with a slight modification of the same rule that's being shown, they might not actually know the correct answer. So I think that's a really helpful point. Anything
Yeah.
else that you would share in terms of, you've already shared such great pieces of advice on best ways to study for the test. Anything else that you'd suggest for students to keep in mind?
Just specifically for students to do. Um, so for, I mean, if you're going to be working on your own, I just mentioned one set of grammar rules with the commas and the punctuating clauses, but it is very easy to just Google the all the English rules on the ACT or English rules tested on the SAT. Get yourself a good list of some of the basic grammar rules, punctuation, word choice, subject verb agreement, and learn one, depending on when you start, learn one every 2 or 3 days. Just one, but memorize it, learn it, make it real. Make it matter for you, whatever your memory tricks are. Like I had memory tricks when I was a kid. My mom got us this book with memory tricks, and we were supposed to memorize the capitals of all the states by making up a story. And I don't remember all of them, but a few of them, I still remember the story that I made up. And I still remember that because, and they say the more nonsensical, the better, but it makes sense to you. So practice with that. For example, this only applies to the ACT because it's science, but I can't find a student who can make any sense of the pH scale. They just can't remember which is acid and which is base. So I just draw it out for them, put the 7 in the middle. Most of them remember that 7 is neutral. So I write acid over here and base over here, and I say A is for acid. A comes first in the alphabet. So acid comes first in the pH scale. And that's it. Now they remember it. They're going to remember it forever. The more they can come up with their own memory tricks for key pieces of knowledge that are consistently tested will help. And if there's a very eager student who wants to get started without a tutor and see how well they can do, then go through a practice test and see if you can pick out on your own. And this is a great exercise to see if you can pick out on your own what was the grammar rule in this question.
I think all those techniques of how to look at the knowledge differently and also how to look at the rules differently, right? So it's not just memorized, but it's the application of the rule and being able to challenge your mind in different ways to be able to understand and really ingrain that learning can make such a big difference. I want to acknowledge the live viewers who are watching this live on Facebook Live. So thanks so much for joining. If you're hearing something that's super helpful, make sure to like or give us a heart. And if you have questions, let us know in the comments because we'll go ahead and make sure to address them on the live. And if we miss your comments because you're watching this on the replay, we will come back and answer them, and Laura or I will come back and make sure to comment back. So Laura, tell us to now focusing again on pandemic specifically, are there any modifications that you'd recommend students make or changes to how they study or expectation changes because of just what we've experienced so far with the pandemic?
Not really for, not for how I approach it. I always approach it this way. So I would say do this if you're not already, but I recommend that once you decide that you are going to start preparing with the practice tests, maybe with a tutor, maybe with some free online courses, try those first, if you want to. But once you are like, I am in it, I am on the ACT or SAT journey now. Once you start it, plan to basically be on that journey. Like you said, you can forget things are not tested the same way that they're tested in school. So if you're going to do that, then you have got to break it up into smaller chunks. And what I recommend is about only 15 to 20 minutes of work, but roughly every day, like 5 days a week or 4 days a week, um, all the way through. And what I recommend is do 3 math problems almost every day, because whichever test, it doesn't matter which test you're taking, the they recycle the same types of questions again and again and again. So the more, and when I say do the test, they are actually from practice tests or from the books. Work through them and let yourself take 5 minutes to answer one question at home while you are struggling through it, because once the mystery of it has clicked and you understand it and you've moved that problem from I don't know how to do it to now it's in the bucket of I could do it again, that's going to stick with you. So it is valuable to do a little bit of practice. And I feel like that fits right in with COVID times, hybrid, completely virtual. Um, in fact, students who are completely virtual may appreciate working with a paper test and not having just let me just do my 3 math problems. I'm actually doing something. I'm not sitting here listening to somebody. And then that would be one passage. So your 15 to 20 minutes is depending on how quickly you work, your 3 math problems and one reading passage, one writing passage. If you're doing ACT, one science passage, you cycle them through. So one day is math plus reading, the next day is math plus English, and on and on. And you're not doing a huge amount. If doing a passage a day is too much, then on Monday you did your math problems and your writing passage, and the next day you grade your writing passage and you analyze your questions. And then the next day you do the next passage. So little bit at a time is what I recommend is helpful all the time. The other thing, which the bigger problem with COVID is how students have approached learning in general. And it could be all over the board. You are probably not sitting and listening to a teacher lecture on Zoom the whole time, but there may be a lot of PowerPoints, there may be a lot of information just kind of spoon fed to you, and you don't do as much with it. It depends, different, every teacher, every school. One of the most important things that I can share with students about the mindset of taking the SAT and the ACT is that it is not like your test that you are taking in school. So when you take a test in school, you have worked on one unit. You have probably gotten a study guide. Your teacher has already gone over the types of questions that are going to be asked. And when you see that question on the test, it's, oh yeah, that's that question. I've already been prepared for that. And students, when I ask them about this, they always nod their heads. They're like, yep. I say, you don't even fully engage with the question, do you? Because it's the question you expected to see. And you don't even fully engage with the answer choices because you studied, so you know what the answer choices are. And it's a very much more global, holistic type of approach to taking tests in school and preparing for tests in school. The ACT and the SAT require a methodical, precise, almost more mathematical approach, because the question is not necessarily the question you expected to see. So you've got to fully engage with the question. I have tutored brilliant kids and they get a question wrong. And we're both like, how did you get that question wrong? And they're like, how did I get this question wrong? And they go back and they look at it and they go, I didn't read all the answers. And they're like, I know, right? But you wouldn't believe how often that happens. And so I've talked to the students and found out that it is because of this kind of, I expected, I saw what I expected to see and then just kind of plugged it in quickly. They also have a tendency to want to get to the answer quickly. Like students, and talk to your students about it. They want to just jump to the answer. And what they have to do instead is go through the process for reading. They have to restate the question and determine, what is this really asking me? What textual evidence do I need to go back and find? Then they have to find the textual evidence. Then they can't just look at that line. They've got to read at least the whole sentence, if not some context above and below. They've got to read the answer choices, and they have to look for the answer choices that really look good, but one word might make it wrong. So if they don't go through that whole process, then they are setting themselves up to fall for the distractor. And that's why we call it a distractor. Right? Psychometricians make this test with distractors on purpose that look right but are wrong. And if you have a more global approach, you're likely to fall for it. If you're always doing the right process, then you're less likely to fall for it.
I think there's three things that you highlighted, I think, then from what you've just shared, that students can immediately recognize right now and try for themselves. The first, like you mentioned, is bite-sized studying, right? So not cramming it all the day or two before a test, which sounds just stressful for me to say, but I know oftentimes ends up what happens because students can procrastinate on it, right? The exam that's coming up for high school is what's more immediate. The homework assignment is what's more immediate, which I completely understand.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then you get this stressful situation for this a very important test that can help determine whether or not you get into a college, whether or not you get into a scholarship program. Big decisions can be made based upon it. But if you're able to spread out the work over time, it is much less overwhelming. And then your chances of actually remembering things and using them for your benefit for other purposes in life increase. So I think I heard
Great
that as
science
super important.
tells us that.
It's transformational, I think, if you're able to do it. The second, like you mentioned, is the acknowledgement that students are learning differently right now. And then when you throw an SAT test in front of them, it's not intended to be similar to what they have done already in high school, right? It's testing different things. I would say even when it comes to college application essays, very similar problem is students may feel like I'm a great writer. I get A's on all of my essays for school. And I highlight, well, that is not the same kind of essay you're writing for your college application. So similarly for these tests, they're not intended to be the same thing as what you get tested in for school. And then that third element that you were highlighting there of just how to be approaching these things and having that attention for detail, right? I think oftentimes people will fast forward and say, I already know, that's easy. I've seen it before. I've seen 100 practice problems just like it. And unfortunately, that is exactly how these things are designed, is so that someone who isn't paying attention will get it wrong, right? So paying attention, bite-sized chunks, and then recognizing that you've been learning in a different way over the past year and giving yourself even some transition time to learn again in a different way. It might not come easily. And so giving yourself as a student the kind of grace and understanding that this is going to be different. So I think you gave some really concrete steps that our students can take. And so I think that would be super helpful. So you've already started describing this, and maybe if you can go a little bit more into how is your approach different? Can you describe your approach working with students and how is it different?
So when students work with me, we are going to, I don't always require a baseline practice test if they have a recent test score already. So we'll look at their test scores. I talk to them about their goals. And I don't know that this is different because any great tutor should do this, but from what I hear, it may be a little different, is I really set up a rapport with the student. I let them know where I'm coming from, what I'm going to expect from them. And I ask for them to agree. Like I lay out what I said about breaking up the homework. And I say, I'm going to be asking you for a little bit of homework every day. And I ask them, how much time do you think you can put in? I put it in their hands. And
Mm.
usually they will offer more time than I require of them. So I'm like, good. I'm glad you're saying you can give it an hour a day because I only want half an hour to 20 minutes a day. And then they can agree. So it's what's different is that this is not just another class you're taking. This is a relationship. I call myself a test prep professional. Sometimes I call myself an academic coach, but there is that coaching relationship. So I'm there to help them reach their goals. The other thing that is, I think, from my participation in the National Test Prep Association, and I've seen how other people tutor, something that's different in the way that I do it is that I have students do their practice tests with me. I do hour-and-a-half sessions instead of just an hour so that they can actually practice right there with me. I time, so if it's an ACT English passage, for example, if you're going to finish, you have to do that in 9 minutes. So I'll set the 9-minute timer for them, and I will give them all the strategies and everything they're supposed to do. And then they'll work it through right there with me. So they just got finished doing it. And that is where we can target. They know what their thinking was on that question. And if their thinking needs to be modified and I need to model the proper way to do it, then they can write it down and learn it. Another thing that's different about me is that I have them keep a list, their toolkit, and it's just like English things I need to know. And as soon as they get an item wrong, they're responsible for writing down what I tell them to write down. I need to learn comma rules. I will teach them the rule. I will have them write it down. I'm not really, it's a little old fashioned, but it's like, there's your notes. Now you need to study them. I'm not going to give them a PowerPoint or anything of what we just said, because I feel like if they write it right after they've seen a question that has that rule in it that they didn't understand, it's going to click for them. And it seems to work because, my students really do get good results. Another thing that's different with me is my students generally work with me for 6 to 10 sessions, not like this 15, 20 sessions, and they get great results. Now, some of them, they get their great results and then they come back and they want to be a little 2 points higher or, 20 points higher on the SAT, and they come back and we work with where they are. So we definitely do that. But because I am a classroom teacher and because I live and breathe diversity and differentiation, I get less in less time I get help them get more done. I feel like that's one of the biggest differences about link private
Well, I
tutoring.
I think that shared accountability is so important, right? Because you could just give them all the answers. And I think similarly to when I work with students, I tell them, I'm not here to give you all the answers. It's also for you to take the accountability to be able to understand yourself more too. And the opportunity that you give students to self-identify what they think they need, and then also identify what they need to learn and take the note of how they interpreted it so they can better understand what they need to do with the information, I think is powerful because it's shared accountability. It's not just Laura has all the answers. It's now, student, I want you to also inform what the answers are that you need for yourself, right? And I think that shared accountability makes it a much stronger partnership. As students are preparing, a question that always comes up is, how soon should students start preparing? Eighth grade, seventh grade, ninth grade? Oftentimes families are worried. Are they waiting too long? Should they start even earlier? And the bar gets earlier and earlier. What's your perspective on how early students should be preparing for these tests?
My perspective is that test preparation is just one part of what I call the college prep journey. And they should start the college prep journey at the very least freshman year. And that includes talking to your guidance counselors, determining what are your goals for college so you can start freshman year building a course schedule that's going to fit. It is helpful if you've got a freshman who is the kind of person that is going to be looking at a high score, needing a high score, or capable of a high score their junior and senior year. Find a tutor now and just start talking with them. Don't have any sessions yet. Just find
Follow in person.
find
Yeah.
the person and start following their social media. Check their website. Have a phone call with them. So, for example, if the parent of a freshman did that with me, then I would talk to them and I would put them on my mailing list. And I would say, I'm going to send you out tips and little things that you can do at, as a family and things to know. Um, I would recommend that they encourage, like I said, the child to read, that they read as a family. Um, as a freshman, you should buy your freshman a graphing calculator. They probably will need two calculators. They'll probably need the plain regular TI-31X or something like that, and a graphing calculator. Those calculators last forever. Buy it freshman year, even if they're not required, so that they can be so familiar with it and maximize its use. That would be huge. And if you want to do any prep, have them take a course that teaches them how to use their calculator. I mean, I know that's math, not the English, but it really is useful. I would recommend that the parent take the time to look at that freshman in high school's writing. And if the parent finds that they're very concerned with the writing, maybe you hire just an academic coach, just an academic tutor at the freshman level, depending on what your ultimate goals are. The other thing that you need to think about as a freshman is think about community service and all those other things. So not as much of the test prep, but yes, the academic prep. So if a parent was in contact with a tutor, they would know that if their child is taking geometry freshman year, as some do, that geometry is one of the things that kids forget by the time they take the ACT. So I like to just be able to tell them, when you learn angle rules and perimeter and area, remember it. And when you learn your grammar rules and your mechanics, you've got to remember that stuff. Don't let it be remember it for the test and then forget it. So it's just to have the prior knowledge of what's coming up is helpful. And then I know I didn't even answer your question. 10th grade, the summer after 10th grade is when they should take their first ACT or SAT. So May or June, and that's your baseline. They probably will have taken a pre-ACT if they take the ACT in their state. They may have taken a PSAT 10th grade. And so they'll have that from the spring. Then they should take the test the summer. And at that point, you look at that and you bring that to a tutor if you're going to go that route. If you're going to hire a test professional, you bring that data in and then you craft a plan. It's not harmful to craft a year-long plans from June to, well, almost a year-long plan, like from June, the end of your sophomore year, to about March, April, when most states have their tests. And it's not like you're going to have constant tutoring that whole time, but you might be a little bit of one-on-one tutoring and then some group classes that just keep you accountable, and then maybe a boot camp and then some one-on-one tutoring throughout the year to just improve, improve, improve. But yeah, 10th grade, end of the summer of your 10th grade year.
I appreciate that you said not to take it until the end of 10th grade. So that is also the rule of thumb. I know there's always exceptions to the rule and it doesn't apply to 100% of the population. Whenever I get asked this question is very similar to what you said, as well as I recommend do not have students taking it in 9th grade unless, there's some exception as to why they should. Otherwise, 9th grade is so full of just adjusting to high school. The adjustment from middle school to high school is a big one. And similarly, from high school to college is another big one, right? And so giving students the space to be able to understand their academic path, develop some relationships with their counselors and their teachers, learn more about themselves, how to get organized in a different way. The demands are different, especially if you're starting to take honors classes in high school, right? 9th grade is very different. And starting off what I would call as kind of contextual studying, right? Or some lighter versions of studying. Reading will help in so many different ways. That's the number one thing I tell people to read, and preferably if you read things not required by school. So outside of school, outside of the reading list that you have to read for your English class, it would be great if you could add an additional book that you actually like yourself, or reading the paper or other articles that are interesting. Because so much of the knowledge that it would apply to the tests is still being gained throughout your classes in 9th and 10th grade. And so short circuiting that to jump and finish the test quickly. I know some folks are thinking, just get the test out of the way and it'll be fine. And you can kind of double dip on the 9th and 10th grade curriculum, which you already have to take anyway, and it will help inform your studying later. And so having that notion of successful transition, and then not putting that pressure on yourself until at least you've gotten through your 10th grade curriculum, I think can be a fact, I think, or an approach that oftentimes is surprising to families who, I know some have their kids already in boot camps in 9th grade for SATs or ACTs. And it can be a little bit rough when you're trying to balance all those changes for high school. So Laura, you've shared so many pieces of valuable information, I think, throughout this conversation. And for those of you who are still with us live, let us know in the comments what questions you might have for Laura. But Laura, let us know then, is there anything else that you'd like the audience to know in addition to what we've already shared?
In addition to what we've already shared, just know that your test score is your test score, and it is not a measure of your intelligence. And it's a measure of rules that you know, which is a good thing, because even if you say, I'm not a good test taker, if you learn certain rules, you are going to get a good enough score. But it's not a reflection on who you are. You don't need to get, a 32 or a 1500 just to say you got that. That's ego. I mean, yeah, I got a good score. It was nice for a few years to say I got a good score, and now it hardly even matters, even though I'm an ACT and SAT test prep tutor. People rarely ask me what I got. It does not matter that much. And the other thing is that while the tests are based on what they call college and career readiness standards. So they are based on standards that you are supposed to learn in high school. And if you have mastered them, then you will have a better time in college. And this is study based and true. But just up to the point that you meet the minimum standards. So once you have hit that 21 on the ACT, or that, I think it's like 1120 or 1140 on the SAT, what that says is you are now ready for college. At that point, if you're below that, you may struggle in college. If you're far above it or just got that basic, it doesn't say how well you're going to do once you're in college. That is about you and did you choose a good major? Are you happy? Are you going to class? Are you organized? All of those different things, and basically what you put into it. So the test scores are about getting you to college, getting you in the door, and hopefully getting you money for not having to pay very much once you're in that door. And so I want people to think about it as this test is an opportunity to open doors. And that's all it is. It is not a reflection on your value as a person ever at all. And don't compare yourself to your siblings. That's just dangerous.
Oh, so everything you just shared is so important because there's so much pressure around it, right? Where students are pursuing those perfect scores and it feeling like it's such a defining moment of their life. And yes, they are important for admissions, and yes, they can help you with scholarships. Once you're actually in college, I don't think you'll ever get asked by anybody. I don't think any employer I've ever had has asked me what my scores were. And so it will help, yes, for college, and yes, it will open the door, but it will not be the predictor of the rest of your life, right? And so being able to understand that you want to still put your best effort in, and if it's not exactly perfect, that also does not mean you'll be a failure, right? There's still many options as well. So Laura, thank you so much for spending this time with us. If families want to learn more about you and your services, where should they go?
I think the easiest way to find me is social media, Facebook or Instagram at Link Private Tutoring. I have a website, linkprivatetutoring.com, and you can find me there as well. But just contact me via social media or send me a text or give me a call. I am going to put up a link for a free list of things that parents of freshmen and sophomores can do to your question that you had about what you can start doing early. And I am going to put that up on my Facebook page, Link Private Tutoring.
Okay, great. So we'll make sure we update the description on Facebook Live here. We'll go ahead and make sure we have that link there that Laura just described. And then for YouTube, it'll be in the comment section as well. And thanks so much for those of you who are watching live. I appreciate the likes. And if you've got questions that we didn't get to, make sure to let us know in the comments and we'll come back and answer after this broadcast. So if you liked what you watched, make sure to like and share this video and let Laura and I know in the comments, what was your biggest takeaway? Anything new or different you learned? Something that you want to try and explore? Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.